Picture this, the night of June 5th, 1944, along a quiet canal in Normandy, France. The air was thick with mist, and everything felt strangely peaceful. Water gently lapped against the bridge, frogs croaked in the marshy ground nearby, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Inside a concrete bunker on the western side, a German soldier named Vera Kortenhaus checked his watch. It was 20 minutes past midnight. Just 4 more hours until his shift would end. He was 43 years old, pulled from his factory job in Stuttgart, and sent here to guard this bridge. Like most of the men stationed there, he was older, not fit enough for the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. This was supposed to be the quiet sector, the safe place where nothing ever happened. The real war was somewhere else, in Russia, in Italy, anywhere but here. The bridge itself was nothing special to look at, just 150 meters of steel and concrete crossing the canal. But it was vital. Troops and supplies needed to move across it to reach the coast. For the 50 or so men defending it that night, though, it was just another boring shift in a war that felt far away. Nearby, in a small cafe beside the bridge, a French family called the Gondres huddled together in their cellar. Georges Gondre, who owned the cafe, had sent his wife Thérèse and their 2 little daughters down there hours earlier. For months now, Georges had been secretly passing information to the French resistance, watching the Germans, counting their patterns, noting everything. Tonight felt different somehow. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. High above the English Channel, 3,000 feet up in the darkness, sat Major John Howard. He was 30 years old, sitting in the lead glider with his stomach tight with nerves and anticipation. Behind him, 28 men sat in complete silence, their faces blackened with camouflage paint. They were soldiers from D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire, and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. They'd practiced this mission so many times that every single man could do his job in total darkness, which was lucky, because that's exactly what they were about to do. At precisely 16 minutes past midnight, the Halifax bomber released its tow rope. Suddenly, the engine noise stopped completely. The silence was absolute. Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, the pilot, could hear his own breathing as he pushed the glider's nose down, aiming for a landing spot he couldn't even see. He was guided only by his stopwatch and the landmarks he'd memorized from aerial photographs. 47 meters from the bridge. That was his target. Land 47 meters from the bridge. Back in the German bunker, Kortenhaus heard something strange. A rushing sound, like wind through trees, except there were no trees nearby and the night was perfectly still. He stepped outside, peering into the darkness, trying to understand what he was hearing. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Something was moving through the air, something big, descending fast. "What is that?" he called out, his voice uncertain and confused. Then the glider appeared out of nowhere, like a massive bird with black wings against the slightly lighter sky. It hit the ground with a tremendous, earth-shaking crash. Wood splintered, the nose tore completely away, and the sound of screaming metal shattered the quiet night. Kortenhaus stood frozen, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. The glider skidded across the grass, throwing up dirt and stones, sliding sideways, finally coming to rest so close to the bridge that its wingtip nearly touched the metal railings. 47 meters. Walwork had hit his mark almost perfectly. For maybe 3 seconds, there was complete silence. Then the side door burst open and men poured out, moving with incredible speed, despite the violent landing. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, 26 years old, was first out, his gun already up, already firing. Behind him came his platoon, 28 men who'd trained for 6 months for this single moment. In the bunker, Kortenhaus finally found his voice and screamed a warning. "Paratroopers! Paratroopers!" But even as he shouted, he knew something was wrong. Paratroopers came from the sky with parachutes. These men had arrived in a glider, and they were already on top of the bridge, already moving, already fighting. The machine gun in the bunker opened fire, bullets streaking across the bridge, but the British were already too close, using the bridge's own structure to hide behind. Grenades came flying through the bunker's opening, and Cortenhouse threw himself backward as explosions rang out, his ears ringing, his eyes watering from the thick smoke. Two more gliders crashed down in quick succession. One landed in the marsh with a tremendous splash. The other skidded to a stop near a pond. More British soldiers emerged, all moving with the same terrifying speed and purpose. The Germans on the eastern side of the bridge suddenly found themselves under attack from multiple directions at once. No time to organize, no time to think, barely time to react. Hans Hickman, a 38-year-old former postal worker from Hamburg, had been sleeping in a bunker 50 meters from the bridge when the first glider landed. The crash woke him up, and he stumbled outside, still half asleep, trying to understand the chaos erupting all around him. He saw British soldiers running across the bridge, saw flashes from their weapons, heard the screams of wounded men. "English! English!" he shouted to the men behind him. But by the time he'd lifted his rifle to his shoulder, the British were already past the bridge's midpoint, already clearing the bunkers on the far side. The entire assault, from landing to capturing the bridge, would take less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes to seize something the Germans had spent months fortifying. In the cafe cellar, Therese held her daughters close as the sounds of battle raged above them. Explosions, gunfire, shouting in German and English. She whispered prayers in French, wondering if they would survive the night, wondering if liberation had finally come, or if this was just another raid that would bring terrible revenge from the Germans. On the bridge itself, Lieutenant Brotheridge led the charge toward the eastern side, firing as he ran. A German machine gun opened up from a trench near the cafe, and Brotheridge went down, hit in the neck. He would die minutes later, becoming the first Allied soldier killed on D-Day, having led his men across the bridge he'd been sent to capture. But his men didn't stop. Sergeant Wagger Thornton took over, leading the assault on the remaining German positions. The British moved with a speed and violence that completely overwhelmed the defenders. These weren't lazy garrison troops used to easy duty. These were elite light infantry, specially trained for this exact mission, moving through the darkness with absolute confidence. Cortenhouse, his ears still ringing from the grenade explosions, crawled out of the damaged bunker to find British soldiers already taking control. A young man, barely 20 years old by the look of him, pointed a gun at his chest and shouted in terrible German, "Hands up! Hands up!" Cortenhouse raised his hands, noticing absurdly that the British soldier looked just as terrified as he felt. The young man's hands were shaking, his breathing rapid, his eyes wide with fear. But the gun never wavered. More German soldiers came out of their positions with hands raised. Some were wounded. All were shocked. They'd been told the Allies would come eventually, but they'd expected warning, expected naval bombardment, expected time to prepare. Not this sudden appearance out of the night sky. Not this overwhelming violence delivered in complete silence until the very last second. Hickman found himself pushed together with a dozen other prisoners near the western side. A British officer, the one who'd led the assault, was organizing his men with calm efficiency, sending some to set up defensive positions, others to check the bridge for explosives. The officer's face was blackened with camouflage paint, making his eyes seem unnaturally white in the darkness. "Do you speak English?" the officer asked. One of the prisoners, a young man named Karl Schumann, who'd worked as a translator before the war, nodded hesitantly. He was 24, drafted 2 years earlier, assigned to this quiet sector because of his poor eyesight. "Tell them," the officer said, speaking slowly and clearly. that if they cooperate, they will not be harmed. Tell them we are British paratroopers, and this is the beginning of the invasion of France. Tell them the war is over for them, Schumann translated, his voice shaking. Some of the German prisoners looked relieved. Others looked stunned, unable to process what they were hearing. The invasion, here, now, without warning. Major John Howard, having climbed out of his glider with nothing worse than bruises, moved among his men, checking for casualties, making sure the bridge was secure. 2 of his men were dead, including Brotheridge, and several were wounded. But the bridge was taken, intact, ready for the tanks that would come later. He pulled out his radio and sent the success signal. 2 simple words that meant everything. Ham and jam. The code that meant both bridges were captured. At German headquarters in Ranville, 3 kilometers away, the duty officer received the first confused reports. A bridge under attack, gliders, British soldiers. The officer, a captain named Klaus Holler, tried to make sense of the information. Gliders? How many? Where exactly? He began making phone calls, trying to organize a counterattack. But in the confusion and darkness, it would take time to gather troops, time to understand what was happening. Back at the bridge, Kortenhaus sat with his fellow prisoners, watching the British soldiers dig in, preparing for the counterattack they all knew would come. One of the British soldiers offered him a cigarette. Kortenhaus took it with trembling hands, noticing that the soldier was young enough to be his son. "Why?" Kortenhaus asked quietly in German. The British soldier didn't understand the language, but he seemed to grasp the question. He pointed east toward the coast and made a sweeping gesture with his hand. Invasion. The word needed no translation. Hickman, sitting nearby, felt a strange sense of relief mixed with his fear. He'd been drafted, forced to leave his postal route in Hamburg, sent to France to defend a bridge he'd never cared about for a cause he'd stopped believing in years ago. Now it was over. He would survive. He would eventually go home. The thought was almost overwhelming. Schumann, the translator, found himself being used by the British. They needed him to question the prisoners, to find out about German positions, reinforcements, defensive plans. He answered their questions truthfully, seeing no reason to protect information that would only get more men killed. The British officer, Major Howard, treated him with surprising courtesy, offering him tea from a thermos, speaking to him as one educated man to another. "You speak excellent English," Howard said with genuine appreciation. "Where did you learn?" "University," Schumann replied. "Before the war, I studied literature." "What did you read?" Howard asked. "Dickens, Hardy, Shakespeare." Howard smiled, a strange expression given the circumstances, given that 2 of his men lay dead nearby. "My wife teaches English literature," he said warmly. "She'd like you." The surreal conversation was interrupted by the sound of engines. A German staff car was approaching from the east, its driver apparently unaware that the bridge had been captured. British soldiers let it get close, then opened fire. The car swerved and crashed into a ditch. The people inside stumbled out with hands raised, joining the growing group of prisoners. One of them was a major named Hans Schmidt, the officer supposedly in command of the bridge's defenses. He'd been in Ranville handling paperwork when the attack came. Now he stood before Howard, his face showing both anger and humiliation. Through Schumann, Howard asked him about German reinforcements, defensive positions, and communication systems. Schmidt refused to answer at first, citing his duty as an officer. But when Howard pointed out that the invasion was clearly beginning, that nothing Schmidt could say would change the outcome, that cooperation might actually save lives on both sides, Schmidt's resistance crumbled. He was 52 years old, a veteran of the First World War, and he was exhausted. "We expected you to come," Schmidt said through Schumann, his voice tired. "But not like this. Not in the night, not in gliders. We expected bombardment, naval guns, landing craft on the beaches. We expected warning. That was rather the point, Howard said dryly. As the night wore on, more German prisoners were brought in. Some were defiant, some were relieved, some were simply confused. A group of Polish men, forced into German military service against their will, were openly happy to surrender, speaking to each other in rapid Polish, actually smiling despite their circumstances. One young German soldier, barely 18 years old, couldn't stop crying. His name was Friedrich Müller, and he'd been drafted 6 months earlier, sent to France after the briefest training. He'd never fired his rifle in combat before tonight, and when the British had come charging out of the darkness, he'd frozen completely, unable to move, unable to think. Now he sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking, while older prisoners tried to comfort him. "I want to go home," he kept saying over and over. "I just want to go home." A British sergeant, hearing the boy's distress, even without understanding the words, brought him water and a blanket. The sergeant was perhaps 22 himself, not much older than Müller, but he moved with the confidence of someone who'd seen combat before. He said something in English, his tone gentle and kind, and Müller looked up, not understanding the words, but understanding the humanity behind them. Kortenhouse watched these interactions with a growing sense of unreality. He'd been told the British were brutal, that they would shoot prisoners, that they showed no mercy. But these men, these paratroopers who'd appeared out of the night and captured the bridge in minutes, were treating their prisoners with surprising decency and respect. "They're just soldiers," he said quietly to Hickman, the realization washing over him. "Like us, just soldiers doing their jobs." Hickman nodded slowly in agreement. "Better trained, though. Much better trained. That was undeniable." The speed and coordination of the British assault had been remarkable to witness. Every man had known exactly what to do, exactly where to go. There had been no hesitation, no confusion, just smooth execution of a perfectly rehearsed plan. It made the German defense look amateurish by comparison, which perhaps it had been. As dawn approached, the sound of heavy engines rumbled in the distance. German tanks finally mobilizing for a counterattack. The British soldiers tensed, checking their weapons, preparing for the fight they knew was coming. The prisoners were moved to a safer location, away from the bridge, while Howard's men readied their anti-tank weapons. Schumann, still serving as translator, found himself in a strange position. He was a prisoner, yes, but he was also useful, needed. He moved between the British soldiers and German prisoners, translating questions and answers, helping to prevent misunderstandings that might get someone killed. "What will happen to us?" one of the German prisoners asked him nervously. After the invasion? Schumann had no certain answer to give. Prison camps, probably. Years of captivity. But compared to dying on the Eastern Front, compared to the brutal meat grinder of the war's final battles, it didn't seem like the worst fate imaginable. The expected German counterattack came at dawn. Tanks and infantry moving toward the bridge with determination. But by then, British reinforcements were arriving steadily. Paratroopers from the main drop zones were linking up with Howard's force. Anti-tank guns were being positioned carefully. The balance of power was shifting rapidly in favor of the Allies. From their position away from the bridge, the German prisoners could hear the battle but couldn't see it. The sound of tank guns booming, the rattle of machine guns chattering, the deep thump of mortars exploding. It went on for hours, a confused fight in the early morning light. But the bridge held firm. The British held. By mid-afternoon, an unexpected sound drifted across the bridge. Bagpipes. Lord Lavate's commandos were arriving from Sword Beach, having fought their way inland through fierce resistance. Piper Bill Millen marched across the bridge, playing Blue Bonnets Over the Border. a surreal and haunting sound amid the carnage of war. The link-up between the seaborne and airborne forces was complete. The plan had worked. Hortonhouse, hearing the bagpipes, felt something inside him break emotionally. It was over. Not just the battle for the bridge, but the war itself, at least for him personally. The Allies were moving inland now, and nothing was going to stop them. He'd known it intellectually since the moment that first glider had appeared out of the darkness. But now, he felt it deep in his heart. Germany had lost this war. In the Gondry Café, Therese emerged from the cellar to find British soldiers inside her home. Major Howard, ever the gentleman, apologized sincerely for the intrusion and the damage done. Therese, realizing that liberation had truly come, that her family had survived this nightmare, burst into tears of joy and relief. She brought out bottles of champagne she'd hidden from the Germans for years, bottles saved for exactly this moment, and shared them with the British soldiers who had freed her home and her country. The German prisoners were marched away later that day, beginning their long journey to prison camps in England. As they walked, they passed British troops moving inland in the opposite direction, an endless stream of men and vehicles, the overwhelming might of the Allied invasion rolling forward like an unstoppable tide. Some of the prisoners looked at this massive display of force with despair and hopelessness. Others looked with a kind of relief mixed with resignation. The war would end now. Surely it had to end soon. Schumann, walking in the column of prisoners, thought about his conversation with Major Howard earlier, about literature and wives and teaching, about the strange civility that could exist even in the very midst of war and violence. Hortonhouse thought about the young British soldier who'd pointed a gun at him with shaking hands, about the sergeant who'd given a blanket to a crying German boy, about the piper who'd played his bagpipes on a bridge that had been bought with precious blood. Years later, after the war ended, Schumann would write about that night in his memoirs, about the sound of the gliders coming out of the darkness like ghosts, about the speed and violence of the assault, about the strange and unexpected kindness shown by the captors toward the captured. He would write about how war revealed both the absolute worst and the surprising best in people, sometimes in the same moment, sometimes in the same person. Hortonhouse would return to his factory job in Stuttgart after his release, would slowly rebuild his life in a devastated Germany, would rarely speak of his war experiences to anyone. But sometimes on quiet nights, when everything was still, he would remember the sound of that glider appearing out of nowhere, the terrible crashing landing, the British soldiers emerging with such incredible speed and purpose. He would remember the young soldier with the shaking hands, the cigarettes shared in the darkness, and that profound moment when he realized the war was finally over for him. Hickman would go home to Hamburg after years in captivity, only to find his beloved city in ruins, his postal route completely obliterated by Allied bombing. He would help rebuild his neighborhood, would carry mail again through streets that were slowly recovering from the devastation, and he would tell his children, when they were old enough to understand, that he had been captured on D-Day at a bridge in Normandy, and that the British soldiers who captured him had treated him with unexpected decency and humanity. Friedrich Müller, the crying boy who'd been so terrified that night, would spend 3 long years in a prison camp in England. He would learn English during his captivity, would eventually immigrate to America after the war ended. He would build a completely new life there, would rarely speak of his brief, terrifying experience as a German soldier to anyone. But he would never, ever forget the British sergeant who'd brought him water and a blanket when he was at his absolute lowest point, who'd shown him genuine kindness when he expected nothing but cruelty and contempt. Major John Howard would return to Pegasus Bridge many times after the war, would attend reunions and commemorations with his fellow veterans, would even meet some of the German soldiers who had defended it that night. They would shake hands warmly, these old enemies, would share memories of that incredible night, would marvel together at how young they'd all been, how much history had turned on those 10 brief minutes of violence in the darkness. The bridge itself would become a powerful symbol, a monument to the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. Renamed Pegasus Bridge after the winged horse emblem of the British Airborne Forces, it would stand as a permanent reminder of the moment when the liberation of Western Europe truly began, when men dropped from the sky in wooden gliders and changed the entire course of history forever. But on that night, in those first confused and terrifying moments after the landing, the German defenders had no sense of history or grand symbolism. They had only confusion and raw fear, the shock of sudden violence erupting from nowhere, the realization that their quiet sector was quiet no more. They had shouted warnings into the darkness, had fought briefly against overwhelming odds, had surrendered to an enemy who turned out to be not the monsters of Nazi propaganda, but simply soldiers themselves, young men doing their duty, professional and efficient, but not unnecessarily cruel or vindictive. What is that? Kortenhaus had shouted when he first heard the glider approaching. It was the beginning of the end. It was history itself arriving in the night without warning, without mercy, but also without unnecessary cruelty or hatred. It was war in its purest form, violent and terrifying, yet ultimately human. It was the moment when the long, difficult road to final victory truly began. That bridge was bought with the precious lives of men like Den Brotheridge, secured by the incredible courage of men like John Howard and his paratroopers, and witnessed by men like Vera Kortenhaus, ordinary soldiers who would carry the vivid memory of that extraordinary night for the rest of their lives. The bridge still stands today at that location, though the original structure was eventually replaced and moved to a museum where visitors can see it up close. But the site itself remains, carefully marked and lovingly remembered, a place where history can almost be felt hanging in the air like morning mist. And sometimes, on quiet nights when everything is still, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the sound of gliders coming out of the darkness, the urgent shouts of men in German and English, the beginning of the end of what would be remembered as the longest night of the entire 20th century.